Welcome back. As President Cyril Ramaphosa prepares to deliver the State of the Nation address, new data shows more South Africans now have access to electricity, water and sanitation than a decade ago. But in many communities, poor service delivery continues to trap families in poverty. Men trying to provide for their households say unsafe neighborhoods, failing infrastructure and overcrowded living conditions make it harder to protect women and children and even harder to build a better future. In eMalahleni, residents told our business reporter Ntokozo Khumalo that poor services are not just a daily struggle, they also come at a deep economic and emotional cost.
Ama-deployers wakhe awadeployile ukuthi asebenzele abantu abawenza umsebenzi wabo. Lana kudala sihamba sicela ukuthi basilungisele just le ndawo lena ukuthi ibe sesimeni esiright ngoba into ebesiyidinga kakhulu ukuthi basisikele izitande, basifakele igezi, basifakele amanzi. Asifuni izindlo zabo, just sifuna ukuthi basihlalise kahle sithole nathi izinsiza ezidingakalayo ebantwini.
Ya isilahleli kabuhlungu man. Siswele into eziningi, indawo asinayo, sidabula lapha emizini yabantu, bicithwa namanzi khona la endleleni, abanye basebenzisa amabhaketi ukuya etoilet nama-toilet asinawo. Nabantwana. So angeke bakhulele endaweni so and then nathi sishonele la iambulance ayingeni la. Angeni next nje akwenzeki next.
Ngina 16 years ngihlala kule ndawo. Ngisuka le KG mall bengihlala khona basuse lapho sabekwa la emsahweni ukusukela ngo2011 until manje amakhansela mane engihlangene nawo wonke ahlulekile akuna electricity siyahlala nje asina gas yonke le 16 years engihleli la angina gas siyasokola akunamuntu osinakayo akuna khansele enendaba nathi
ne ward committee ya la ward 7 but la sihlala khona endaweni yethu lamavakha kudala vele sibhizi ngayo ukuthi vele silwele ukuthi sihlaleni kahle ngoba sihlala kanti nani niyabona izindlela kugcwele amanzi abantu bayagula kunomfula khona la duzane kunama flood ayenzekayo la South Africa nibonini eLimpopo kwenzakalani nalana ekhaya kungenzeka kanjalo
sike ukusukela ngeso sikhathi ikhansela manje elisinalo lelesi4 leli sinalo lizawuphelelwa manje lelesi4 ikhansela efikayo ngiyahamba nizawufunduzwa iphela isikhathi sayo ikhansela efikayo nizawuhamba nizawufunduzwa into eyenziwayo qha sihlala sibhaliswa kuyachintshwa nalapha eminyango kubhaliswe nezinambara ezintsha sonke esisikhathi salama khansela mina ke oko ndilapha abanye ke sebaze ke basweleka ke abanye ke bapenshela bahamba ngokuhlukahlukana mina ke ndisekhona apha waze waphela ke umsebenzi ke ndilapha ngwaze pensionini.
In the 2018 SONA, President Ramaphosa prioritized improving educational quality, expanding early childhood development, and upgrading school infrastructure, specifically targeting the eradication of pit latrines. He also spoke about the introduction of coding, robotics, and the 3-stream model to enhance technical and vocational subjects. Has the sector improved since? What can we expect in the coming State of the Nation address, especially where education is concerned? I'm joined now in studio by Section 27 budget researcher Matshidiso Lencoasa. A very good evening to you and thank you so much for your time.
Good evening. Thanks for having me again.
It's an absolute pleasure, Matshidiso. So maybe let's just take it back to 1994. As a researcher, when you look at some of the analysis, how would you assess the progress that we've made as a country since 1994? Are we moving in the right direction?
Sure. I think that's a really good question to reflect on the State of the Nation address that we received this week, because it is important that we can't necessarily build a public education system that works for all overnight. And so we need to be building and looking back, are we doing more and more each year? And I think there has been significant progress in terms of accessing education in the country over the past 30 years. Unfortunately, though, we know that more needs to be done. So some of the notable gains, I believe, are interventions like the school nutrition program, for instance, because, millions of learners rely on this intervention. Some actually say that it's the only proper meal that they get each day. And so it has had significant impact on the right to basic education, but also the right to healthcare, nutrition, etc. I think that there has been progress that has been made in a variety of ways. Access to education interventions, also like scholar transport, for instance, even though that is topical around the implementation and whether we're regressing or not. So I think there has been progress, but in order for us to maintain that momentum, I think political promises are one thing, but it is also important to make sure that these political promises are underpinned by investments that follows that. And so with the budget speech that follows the State of the Nation address in 2 weeks' time, and the state that we find our country in a fiscal position, like we are actually in the best position that we've been in a long time in order to actually action these political promises. So we've made a lot of progress, but definitely more needs to be done and more can be done. We just need to put our heads down and do that.
Most certainly. I mean, you do speak about a lot that has been done, some inroads and achievements that we have seen in education. And particularly, I mean, that which the President addressed in his maiden speech was around ECD and ensuring the importance of breaking the cycle when it comes to poverty through early education. How meaningful are these improvements when addressing especially that entrance and the access in early childhood development?
Yeah, I think last year's State of the Nation, as you mentioned, ECD was one of the big stories. And I think it's also a positive direction because not only was there a political promise around ECD, especially over the past few years, so not just last year, but there was actually investment that was backed behind it, turning the sector that is quite informal and sporadic in its implementation and building it into something that can be more, more uniform, more accessible for everyone and more consistent. There can be interventions that we see, for example, like in normal schooling. So I mentioned the school nutrition program.
Yeah.
Well, there are learners, for instance, or children rather, who do not go to school, of course, because they're not of school-going age, but they don't benefit from interventions because the school nutrition program is for schools only. And so with ECD being formalized, there's an opportunity to implement introduction, making sure that children below school-going age are still able to eat. So I think that that's just an example of what the power of investing in ECD can do and investing in education in our country can do. And I think that last year's SONA was also positive in the sense that the ECD sector received what we see as a bailout. So it received the highest investment that it had ever received in South African democratic history, in our democratic history. And so we're really looking forward to hearing what the President and what government's view is on how do we maintain that momentum, especially in a sector that still continues to struggle with resources in spite of the bailout, but also registering ECD centers and just dealing with those, turning the informal into the formal.
And I think one thing about the education department is also just the reliance on other departments. I mean, the school nutrition program would have very strong ties with the social development department. And when you look at the inroads that have been made, particularly when it comes to the pit latrines, that then speaks to infrastructure and the public works department. How important is it for us to measure the Department of Education also up against other departments that they rely on for some of the progress or the non-progress in some instances?
Yeah, I think it is really good to look at government's whole of government approach, because when a learner goes to school, it's not just the right to education, but like we mentioned, there are other rights that are implemented. Like we need a learner to be healthy in order for them to concentrate in school. We need them to actually go to school. So we need the department, transport and public works, so that they can be able to go to school, like scholar transport, which is so topical now. We mentioned social development. So we can't do it, in order to really do what's best for the children and learners in this country, we really need every department to come together and see and pool our resources and make sure that our interventions and our response is consistent and coherent. And that is something that actually civil society and I think the country at large had been criticizing government for. The siloed approach for years is that when something breaks down, it's pointing fingers at different directions. But hopefully now with this, and I think it's good that you mentioned that by coming together to have this consistent approach and being a one government, an era of unity really, that we can actually do really what's in the best interest of the learner and hold governments as a whole to account for ensuring that learners do receive quality basic education.
And one such example, especially when it comes to infrastructure, we heard recently from the MEC of Education, Matshidiso, when he was explaining about some of the shortages or the choices that parents make with regards to where they want to place their children. And he said municipalities are also to blame in some instances where spatial planning is not considering in the building of schools when they allow especially private companies to come in and build housing units.
Yes, and that also, I mean, it culminates a lot in the school admissions crisis that we saw earlier this year. I think there were more than 5,000 unplaced learners at the beginning of the year, which is concerning. And this was especially in provinces, rapidly expanding provinces like Gauteng, for instance, where we do see housing developments that are made, but then, building new schools is taking a lot longer. Infrastructure projects take a lot longer than they really should in our country, but then also we do have the complexity of informal settlements that mushroom, and those learners are also entitled to quality basic education services. So I think it is, again, the municipality, it is the, really as we're talking about an all-of-government approach and not a siloed approach, that everyone needs to come together to really put the best interest of learners in this country at the heart of it. Because if, the state of the nation that's being under the banner of a nation that works for all, in order to do that, really education is one of those interventions that can do so. But then we also know that education is, the education sector in our public school system is two-tiered and also reflects some of the shortcomings of our country and really shows the state of our nation. A lot can be done and a lot needs to be done.
And the Department of Education gets or just education in its entirety, gets the biggest slice of the budget. Do you see that translating in terms of what the investment is to what the output is when we see young children start from grade 1 right through to grade 12?
Yeah, so I think at the beginning, so post-94, there was a rapid investment in interventions like the school nutrition program, scholar transport, which we've mentioned, textbook access, etc. And there was investment that backed it. But over the past decade, there has been a slowing down, I think, lower economic growth and also just government priorities, prioritizing our ballooning debt servicing costs. So recently, we've been spending more money servicing our debt than we have on accessing public services, including education and healthcare. And while last year we saw some of the highest increases in education over the past decade, it's not really a silver bullet because it just feels like a drop in the ocean because provincial departments are still in debt. And then we also have issues of underspending and irregular expenditure and problems with procuring infrastructure. So it takes a lot longer to actually realize, build safe schools and all of those things. And I really do think that, there has been progress that has been made, but then it does get undermined by a disinvestment in education. And we hope that this year we've turned a corner on that because even the department, even the finance minister had conceded that these austerity measures, they just don't work.
And when you look at the broader state of our education, how do you think it influences particularly the socio-economic challenges that we face in the country, such as unemployment, poverty and inequality?
Yeah, so in the State of the Nation address last year, the president actually referred to education as a key to growing our economy and to alleviating or eradicating poverty. And, that is a view that we all agree on as a country. But of course, that is rhetoric. We still live in a country that has an unemployment crisis, particularly among young people in our country. And so there is a disconnect because access to education is one thing and there are interventions towards that. But are we equipping learners, from the beginning to when they start school to then entering the work field and economic participation? And I think that one of the opportunities that we have is that there are millions of young people who are ready and wanting to serve our country and rebuild our public education sector. And, through teaching or teaching assistants, the public employment program, the basic education one, is the biggest one that the country has. And I really think that it's an opportunity, to also, do a dual approach, which is that we hire young people who want to serve and who want to earn incomes also and also participate in the economy. I think there's a win-win in that way. And I think that it's important for government to also see it in that way, that it's not one department or the other, or one competing thing, but all of these departments must come together so that we can really build a nation that works for all. And that includes addressing our unemployment crisis, and education, like you said, is one of the is a really powerful intervention in doing so.
It certainly is, and it's just creating that department to also just be an employer of choice, so that many of the young teachers could want to take up many of those posts. Looking ahead, we've got then the SONA happening this Thursday. What recommendations would you give the president, or what commitments do you think he's going to make, particularly with regards to education?
Sure. Well, firstly, we'd love to see continued investment and accelerated investment in our infrastructure, so building safe schools, roads as well, to make sure that learners are safe, because currently we do have a state where many learners across the country are actually risking their lives and their safety so that they can access their constitutional rights. So when the president mentioned turning South Africa into a construction site, I think it was referring to ports and referring to economic sectors, but we also see education as one opportunity to also do that, and just improving the quality of our infrastructure projects and making sure that they're timeous, so that we can get these safe schools and build new schools in our country and absorb as many learners as possible. So that's one area that we'd love to see an investment in education infrastructure as normal. And I think we're also looking forward to rebuilding our public workforce. Currently, they're still under, there's a shortage of teachers in our public school system, but there's also so many unemployed teachers across the country, and I think we can reconcile that, and it's an opportune moment to do so. And then I think also a really important intervention is to also look at our scholar transport, which is a program that has been not politically, not one of the top priorities over the past decade, because it hasn't been making the news. But unfortunately, because of the fatalities that happened this year, I think that it's a sound to an alarm. Like, how do we make sure that learners are safe and no longer risking their lives to access quality basic education? So I think those are some of the 3 areas that we'd love to see the president prioritize in education. But of course, it's one thing to make those political promises. We'd also love to see investments that backs those promises,
so that we do have the outcomes that we want with our young children in the Department of Education. Matshidiso, thank you so much for your time and for your insights this evening. That was Matshidiso Lencoasa, who is the budget researcher for Section 27.